The convoy left Site 47 at 400 hours, when the thermometer already registered 92 degrees Fahrenheit. By the time the sun crested the horizon, driver Marcus Webb could feel the heat bleeding through the windshield of the lead vehicle, like radiation from a nuclear blast. 3 vehicles, 12 personnel. 1 cargo container welded shut and marked with hazard warnings that made even seasoned Foundation operatives uncomfortable. The asset inside, designated SCP-7033-Prime, was being transferred across 400 kilometers of restricted Australian Outback to a deep containment facility at Site 91. The route had been selected specifically because it avoided population centers, passed through designated dead zones where satellite coverage was deliberately sparse, and crossed terrain so hostile that civilian traffic was virtually non-existent. Webb had driven convoy routes for the Foundation for 8 years. He'd transported reality benders through populated cities, mimetic hazards through airport checkways, and once, memorably, a Class 5 biological anomaly that leaked corrosive fluid through its container for 6 straight hours. He considered himself unshakable, but he'd never driven through heat like this. In the passenger seat, Dr. Sarah Chen checked her tablet for the 14th time in as many minutes. The containment sensors on the cargo truck behind them showed green across the board. SCP-7033-Prime remained stable at -40 degrees Celsius, held in a cryogenic suspension system powered by 3 redundant generators. The irony wasn't lost on anyone. They were hauling a frozen anomaly through one of the hottest places on Earth. "Radio check," Webb said into his headset. "Cargo actual, all green," came the response from Lieutenant Morrison in the transport truck. His voice carried the flat, professional tone of military personnel who'd learned not to show discomfort. "Tail vehicle, all clear," added Agent Rodriguez from the rear security SUV. Webb glanced at his dashboard. The external temperature reading had climbed to 108 degrees. It was barely 6:30 hours. The road stretched ahead like a ribbon of melted tar, shimmering in waves that made the horizon appear liquid. Heat distortion painted the landscape in watercolor uncertainty. The scrubby vegetation and red earth seemed to vibrate and blur at the edges of perception. In the distance, what looked like vast lakes of crystal-clear water spread across the desert floor, their surfaces mirror-bright and impossibly inviting. "God, I'd kill for a swim in one of those," Chen muttered, nodding toward the nearest Mirage. Webb said nothing. He'd learned long ago that mirages were just tricks of light and heat, refractions that made the sky reflect off the superheated ground. The human brain, desperate for water in this environment, interpreted the shimmer as salvation. But there was no water out there. There was only heat, silence, and more heat. The convoy maintained a steady 80 kilometers per hour. Any faster, and they risked tire blowouts on the scorching asphalt. Any slower, and they'd fall behind schedule, which meant more time exposed to the climbing temperature. The mission parameters were clear. Reach Site 91 by 1600 hours, before the predicted temperature peak of 130 degrees. At 0715, Webb noticed something odd. The Mirage ahead, the one that had been hovering at the horizon for the past 20 minutes, wasn't receding as they approached. Normally, mirages stayed perpetually out of reach, an optical illusion that moved with the observer. But this one seemed to be holding position, growing larger and more defined as they drove toward it. "Chen, you seeing this?" he asked. She looked up from her tablet, squinting through the windshield. "The water effect? Yeah, it's pretty vivid. Must be the extreme heat. I read somewhere that when temperatures exceed 110, the refraction index gets wonky." "That's not what I mean. Watch the edges." They drove in silence for another minute. The Mirage now covered the entire width of the road ahead, a shimmering expanse that looked less like reflected sky and more like actual standing water. Webb could see what appeared to be ripples moving across its surface. "Huh," Chen said. "That's unusual." Webb's hands tightened on the steering wheel. In his 8 years with the Foundation, he'd learned to trust his instincts about anomalies, and his instincts were screaming that something was wrong. "Morrison, you seeing what I'm seeing up ahead?" he radioed. There was a pause. "The Mirage? Yeah, it's a big one. Probably nothing to worry about." "Probably isn't a word we use, Lieutenant." "Fair point. What do you want to do?" There's no alternate route for the next 60 kilometers. Webb checked his mirrors. Behind them, the landscape looked clear, just the normal heat shimmer and empty road. Ahead, the Mirage now filled his entire field of vision, close enough that he estimated they'd reach it in less than 30 seconds. Maintain speed, he decided, but everyone stay alert. 20 seconds. The Mirage didn't move, didn't dissipate. If anything, it became more solid-looking, more real. Webb could see distinct patterns in its surface now, geometric shapes that moved with unsettling synchronicity. 10 seconds. Chen leaned forward, her scientific curiosity overriding caution. Marcus, that's not behaving like any Mirage I've ever. They entered the shimmer. For a moment, Webb's vision went completely white, as if they'd driven into a wall of translucent gel. The temperature inside the cab spiked instantly. He could feel it on his skin, in his lungs. Then, just as suddenly, they were through, and the Mirage was behind them, receding in the rearview mirror exactly like a normal Mirage should. "What the hell was that?" Chen whispered. Webb checked the radio. "Morrison, Rodriguez, status?" "We're okay," Morrison replied slowly. "That was weird. Felt like driving through warm syrup for a second there." "Rodriguez?" "All clear, but my skin's tingling, like I stuck my hand in a tank of electric eels." Webb glanced at Chen. Her face was flushed, and she was rubbing her arms as if cold despite the obvious heat. He felt it too, a strange sensation of having been touched all over, examined, assessed by something that had no business touching anything. "Log it," Webb said. "Mark the coordinates. We'll report when we reach Site 91. The external temperature reading now showed 115 degrees. By 0830, they'd passed through 3 more of the anomalous mirages. Each time felt worse than the last. The sensation of penetrating something that was almost but not quite solid, the spike in temperature, the feeling of invisible attention focused on them. After the third one, Rodriguez reported that his vehicle's paint looked weird, though he couldn't articulate exactly how. Chen was running constant diagnostics on the cargo container. "Still green," she reported, but her voice carried an edge of worry. "But the external temperature is affecting coolant efficiency. We're burning through reserves faster than projected." "How much faster?" "We should still be fine if we maintain schedule, but if anything delays us." She didn't need to finish the sentence. If the cryogenic system failed and SCP-7033 prime reached ambient temperature, the containment protocols were clear. Immediate evacuation to a minimum distance of 5 kilometers, followed by aerial bombardment of the site. Webb didn't want to think about trying to run 5 kilometers through 120-degree heat. The sun climbed higher, becoming less a celestial object and more a physical weight pressing down on the convoy. The sky lost its blue color, fading to a washed-out white that merged seamlessly with the horizon. The landscape took on a dreamlike quality, as if they were driving through a photograph that someone had left in the sun too long, all the colors bleached and running together. At 9:45, the radio crackled with Morrison's voice, tense and uncertain. "Lead vehicle. I'm seeing something up ahead. Multiple somethings. Looks like... I don't know what it looks like." Webb squinted through the windshield. The heat distortion made it difficult to see clearly, but there were definitely shapes on the road ahead. Lots of them. They appeared to be standing still, arranged across the highway in a pattern that might have been random or might have been deliberate. As they drew closer, the shapes resolved into more mirages, but these were different. They rose vertically from the road surface like walls of transparent gel, each one roughly the size and shape of a person. There had to be 20 or 30 of them, scattered across both lanes. "Slow down," Webb ordered, easing off the accelerator. The convoy decelerated to 40 kilometers per hour, then 30. The Mirage shapes didn't move. They just stood there, shimmering and rippling in the heat, looking increasingly solid as the distance closed. "This is wrong," Chen said quietly. "Mirages don't do this. They can't hold vertical shapes like that. The physics doesn't work." "Since when has physics been reliable around Foundation assets?" Webb countered, but his mouth had gone dry. At 20 meters, he could see that the shapes weren't just person-sized, they were person-shaped. Each one had a distinct form: head, torso, limbs. They looked like silhouettes made of living heat haze, like people constructed from concentrated sunlight and desert air. "Orders?" Morrison asked over the radio. Webb made a decision he would later regret. We go through, same as before, maintain speed and don't stop. They hit the first shape at 25 kilometers per hour. The impact wasn't physical, not exactly. The SUV's front end penetrated the Mirage thing without any resistance, but Webb felt the cabin temperature jump 10 degrees in an instant. The windshield fogged over from the inside, condensation appearing and evaporating in rapid cycles. Something pressed against the vehicle from all sides, not solid, but not insubstantial either, like driving through honey made of heat. Then they were through, and Webb gasped without realizing he'd been holding his breath. "Everyone okay?" he managed. "Define okay," Rodriguez replied. "I just drove through what felt like a ghost made of hot air, and my vehicle's thermometer is reading 140 degrees external. That can't be right." But it was right. Webb's dashboard confirmed it. The temperature outside had jumped 25 degrees in the span of passing through the Mirage shapes, and it was still climbing. Chen was staring at her tablet, her face pale despite the heat flush on her cheeks. The cargo container's coolant system just shifted to emergency reserves. We're losing the battle against the external temperature. How long do we have? At this rate, maybe 4 hours before the internal temperature starts rising. After that, she met his eyes. We have to get to Site 91. We can't stop. Behind them, the Mirage shapes had resumed their positions on the road, as if the convoy had never passed through them. Webb watched them in his mirror until heat distortion made them indistinguishable from the landscape. The radio crackled. "Lead vehicle, this is Morrison. I need to report something. Go ahead." When we passed through those things, I could swear I felt them looking at us, not just at the vehicles, at us specifically, like they were curious. Webb didn't respond immediately. He'd felt it too, though he'd been trying to convince himself it was just heat stress, the beginning of delirium that affected everyone who spent too long in extreme temperatures. But Morrison was ex-military, trained to observe and report without embellishment. If he was mentioning it, it meant something. "Noted," Webb said finally. "Everyone increase water intake and watch for signs of heat exhaustion. We're only halfway there." By 1100 hours, the external temperature had reached 125 degrees. The landscape had taken on an alien quality, as if they'd driven off the edge of the earth and into some otherworldly realm where the sun never set and the horizon never solidified. The road ahead looked like it was melting, the asphalt seeming to ripple and flow like black water. Every surface shimmered with heat distortion. Perspective became meaningless. Objects that should have been far away appeared close, while nearby landmarks seemed to recede into impossible distances. And everywhere, mirages. They were no longer occasional phenomena but constant presences. The transparent shapes lined the road like spectators at a parade, dozens of them, then hundreds. They varied in size and form, some human-shaped, others more ambiguous, a few that looked disturbingly like the convoy vehicles themselves. They didn't move, didn't react, just stood in the heat haze and watched. Chen had stopped looking at her tablet. Instead, she stared out the window at the Mirage things, her scientific training clearly at war with growing unease. "This isn't natural," she said. "Even for anomalies, this isn't right. It's like the heat itself is alive." Webb had to agree. The air outside looked thick, almost gelatinous, shimmering with colors that shouldn't exist in nature. Ultraviolet purples, infrared reds, shades that hurt to look at directly. The sun had become a white hole in the sky, not so much illuminating the landscape as erasing it, burning away details until only essential shapes remained. "How's the cargo?" he asked. "Holding, but barely. We're down to 30% coolant reserves. The system wasn't designed for external temperatures this high." She paused. "Marcus, I'm starting to think those aren't mirages." "What else would they be?" "I don't know, but mirages don't cluster around vehicles. They don't form patterns, and they definitely don't." She stopped abruptly. "Don't what?" "Don't multiply," she finished quietly. "When we first entered the dead zone, there were maybe a dozen of them. Now there are hundreds. They're increasing in number as we proceed." Webb's training told him to maintain calm, to treat this as just another anomalous situation requiring documentation and careful navigation. But his instincts, those same instincts that had kept him alive through 8 years of transporting nightmares, told him they were in serious trouble. "Morrison, Rodriguez," he radioed. "I want constant visual confirmation that you're both still there. Check in every 2 minutes." "Understood," Morrison replied. "And Webb, my crew is reporting auditory phenomena. Nothing clear, just sounds on the edge of hearing, like whispers but made of heat." Webb was about to respond when the road ahead shimmered, and suddenly there was a lake. Not a mirage of a lake, an actual body of water, crystal clear and impossibly inviting, stretching across the highway for what looked like 100 meters. He could see the bottom through the transparent water, could see ripples on the surface, could almost smell the cool moisture in the air. "That's not real," Chen said, but she didn't sound convinced. Webb slowed the convoy. The lake didn't disappear. It just sat there looking absolutely, perfectly real. "It's a mirage," he said firmly. "A very convincing one, but still just refracted light. Then why isn't it moving? Why can I see our reflection in it?" Webb looked. She was right. The lake's surface showed a mirror image of the convoy, perfect down to the smallest detail. And as he watched, the reflection did something the real vehicles hadn't done yet. It stopped. The reflected convoy came to a halt in the middle of the lake that wasn't a lake, and the reflected personnel began to exit their vehicles. Webb could see tiny figures that looked exactly like himself, and Chen climbing out of the lead SUV, see Morrison's crew emerging from the transport truck. They moved in the heat-distorted distance like actors in a silent film, their gestures suggesting confusion, distress. Then the reflected figures began to sink into the lake, slowly at first, then faster, their bodies dissolving into the transparent water like sugar in tea. "Drive," Chen whispered. "Drive now." Webb punched the accelerator. They hit the lake at 60 kilometers per hour. The SUV's front end penetrated the surface with a sensation like plunging into cold molasses. Except it wasn't cold. It was hot, hotter than anything Webb had ever felt. Hot enough that he could feel his skin tightening and his lungs burning with each breath. The windshield cracked in a spiderweb pattern. The dashboard lights flickered and died, then came back on, showing error messages across every system. The lake gripped them, slowed them, tried to pull them under into depths that shouldn't exist on a flat desert highway. Webb kept his foot down, engine screaming, tires finding purchase on something that might have been road or might have been something else entirely. Then they were through, gasping and shaking, and the lake was behind them. Webb glanced in the mirror to confirm Morrison and Rodriguez had made it through. Both vehicles emerged from the shimmer looking intact, though Morrison's transport truck was trailing smoke from its engine compartment. "Status!" Webb demanded. "We're okay," Morrison reported, but his voice was tight with stress. "But that wasn't a mirage. I don't know what it was, but it was solid. It had mass. It tried to stop us." "Rodriguez?" "Here, but my engine temperature is redlining. I'm going to need to slow down." Webb checked his own dashboard. The external temperature reading had maxed out at 140 degrees, the sensor's upper limit. The actual temperature could be higher. Probably was higher, given how the air outside looked like it was boiling. Chen was entering data into her tablet with shaking hands. "Coolant at 15%. We're not going to make it to Site 91 before the system fails." "Yes, we are," Webb said, more firmly than he felt. "We're only 90 kilometers out. Another hour, and we're there." "Marcus, in an hour, the internal temperature of the cargo container will reach critical. When that happens," a bang like a gunshot cut her off. Webb's head snapped to the side mirror in time to see Morrison's transport truck lurch violently to the right. Steam erupted from under the hood in a massive white plume. "Radiator's blown," Morrison shouted over the radio. "We're losing coolant fast. I have to stop." "Negative," Webb responded. "You stop, you die. Keep moving." "I don't have a choice. Engine temperature is critical. If I keep going, the whole thing will seize up and we'll be stranded anyway." Webb made a split-second decision that he knew might doom them all. "Pull over. Everyone out. Transfer the crew to the other vehicles. Rodriguez, you're taking Morrison's people. We move in 2 minutes." "What about the cargo?" Chen asked. "The container has its own power supply. It'll hold temperature while we transfer personnel." He hoped. The convoy pulled to the side of the road. if the shimmering strip of asphalt could even be called a road anymore. Webb pushed his door open and immediately regretted it. The heat hit him like a physical wall, so intense it was painful. The air felt solid, pressing against his skin with palpable weight. He couldn't breathe properly. Each inhalation was like inhaling fire, and his lungs rejected the superheated air on instinct. The sun glared down from its zenith, a white-hot coin that seemed to fill half the sky. And the silence. That was worse than the heat. There should have been wind, insect sounds, the rustle of sparse vegetation. Instead, there was nothing. Absolute silence, as if the heat had killed even the capacity for sound. Webb could hear his heartbeat, could hear the blood rushing in his ears, could hear Chen's labored breathing beside him, but from the desert itself, nothing. The landscape had become a tomb. The mirages surrounded them. They stood in a rough circle around the stopped convoy, perhaps 50 meters away. Transparent, shimmering, person-shaped columns of heat distortion that Webb could now see were definitely not optical illusions. They had substance, presence. He could see the light bending around them in ways that suggested actual mass, actual form. And they were watching. Morrison's crew scrambled out of the transport truck, 4 people who immediately began showing signs of heat distress. One of them, a young woman named Chen didn't recognize, fell to her knees on the asphalt and vomited. Another stood swaying, clearly on the edge of heat stroke. "Move," Webb shouted, but his voice came out as a croak. "Rodriguez, get them into your vehicle now!" The crew stumbled toward the rear SUV, but they were moving too slowly, their bodies already shutting down from the extreme temperature. The asphalt under their feet was soft, tacky, hot enough to melt rubber soles. Morrison stayed with his truck, trying to assess the damage. "It's completely dead," he reported. "Radiators shredded, coolant's gone, engine seized. We'll need a tow." "Leave it," Webb ordered. "Everyone into the remaining vehicles. We're abandoning the truck." "What about the cargo?" Webb turned to look at the transport truck's cargo container. Steam rose from its surface where the external heat met the cryogenic interior. The temperature differential was creating a microclimate around the container. He could actually see frost forming on the metal, only to instantly evaporate into steam. "Check the telemetry," he told Chen. She pulled up the data on her tablet, squinting at the screen in the brutal sunlight. Still functional, the container's self-sufficient for power, but without the truck's auxiliary cooling system, it's going to drain its reserves much faster. "How much faster?" "We'll reach critical temperature in..." She did rapid calculations. 30 minutes, maybe less. 30 minutes. They were still 90 kilometers from Site 91. Even at maximum speed, they couldn't make it in time. The mirages were closer now. Webb was certain they hadn't moved, but somehow the circle had tightened. The shimmering figures stood perhaps 30 meters away, close enough that he could see details in their forms. They weren't just person-shaped, they were person-specific. He could make out what looked like faces, limbs, even suggestions of clothing. And they were all facing inward, focused on the convoy with an attention that felt almost predatory. "We need to go," Rodriguez called from the rear vehicle, his voice tight with poorly suppressed panic. "Those things are getting closer." He was right. Even as Webb watched, the circle contracted by another few meters. The mirages didn't walk. They simply occupied new positions, as if they'd always been standing there, and reality was just catching up. "Everyone in the vehicles now," Webb ordered. "Morrison, you're with me and Chen. Rodriguez, you've got everyone else. We're leaving the truck." "But the cargo container comes with us. Rodriguez, can your SUV handle the weight?" "It's rated for 3 tons. The container's 2.7. It'll be tight, but doable. Then we transfer it." "Move." The crew scrambled into action, but they were all showing signs of heat exhaustion. Movements were sluggish, coordination was off. Morrison tried to operate the truck's cargo crane to lift the container, but the hydraulics had failed along with everything else. "Manual release," he muttered, climbing onto the truck bed. The metal was hot enough to cook on, and Webb could see Morrison's hands blistering as he worked the emergency latches. The mirages were 20 meters away. Webb could feel them now. Feel their presence pressing against his skin like a physical touch. The temperature seemed to spike with their proximity, climbing past any reasonable limit into ranges that should have been instantly fatal. His vision was starting to blur, dark spots swimming at the edges. Heat exhaustion progressing toward heat stroke. "Morrison, faster," he called. The container came free with a metallic clang that echoed strangely in the silent desert. Morrison and two others manhandled it toward Rodriguez's SUV, moving with desperate urgency. The container's surface was frosted with ice despite the ambient heat, creating a surreal visual contrast. 15 meters. The Mirages weren't just closer, they were more solid. Webb could see through them less clearly now. They were becoming real. Or perhaps they'd always been real and were simply choosing to reveal their true nature. He could see textures in their transparent forms, patterns that looked almost biological. And he could hear them now, a sound like wind through dead trees, like whispers in a language made of temperature differentials and light refraction. "They're not mirages," Chen said beside him, her voice dreamy with heat delirium. "There's something that lives in the heat, something that camouflages itself as mirages because that's what humans expect to see in the desert. But they're real. They're alive." "Get in the SUV," Webb ordered, pulling her toward the vehicle. Morrison and his crew got the container secured to Rodriguez's vehicle with tie-down straps that immediately began smoking from the temperature differential. It wasn't a proper mounting, but it would have to do. 10 meters. Webb could see eyes now. Or things that served the same purpose as eyes. Organs of perception embedded in the transparent flesh of the Mirage creatures. They looked like lenses, like droplets of concentrated sunlight, and they tracked the convoy personnel with obvious intelligence. "Everyone in now!" Webb shouted. The crew piled into the two remaining vehicles. Morrison climbed into the passenger seat of Webb's SUV, his hands wrapped in strips of cloth torn from his shirt. His palms were badly burned from handling the superheated metal. "Go, go, go!" Rodriguez called over the radio. Webb started the engine and immediately knew something was wrong. The temperature gauge was maxed out, the air conditioning was blowing hot air, the dashboard was showing critical warnings across every system, and the Mirages were 5 meters away. He could see them clearly now, see that they weren't just creatures that looked like heat distortion. They were creatures made of heat distortion, living beings constructed from temperature gradients and refracted light. Their forms were translucent but definite, their bodies rippling with internal movement like the surface of water. And they were reaching out, extending appendages toward the vehicles with obvious intent. Webb punched the accelerator. The SUV lurched forward, engines screaming in protest. Behind them, Rodriguez's heavier vehicle struggled to accelerate with the added weight of the cargo container. The Mirages closed in, their transparent forms brushing against the vehicle's surfaces. The temperature inside Webb's SUV spiked to unbearable levels. It felt like being inside an oven. The air was so hot it burned to breathe. The steering wheel was scalding under Webb's hands. Beside him, Morrison was gasping, his face bright red, sweat pouring off him in streams. In the back seat, Chen had her eyes closed, her breathing rapid and shallow. "Stay with me," Webb shouted, but his voice came out as a whisper. His throat was too dry, his lungs too stressed. The heat was killing them, cooking them alive inside their own vehicle. He kept driving. The road ahead was completely obscured by heat distortion now, a rippling tunnel of uncertainty. The Mirages were everywhere, lining both sides of the highway, clustered in the middle distance, standing in formations that suggested organization, intelligence, purpose. The convoy was running a gauntlet through their territory, and the creatures were not pleased. Over the radio, Rodriguez's voice crackled with static and stress. "Container temperature is rising. We're at critical. 5 minutes until containment failure. 5 minutes until SCP-733-prime reached ambient temperature. 5 minutes until whatever was frozen in that container woke up in the middle of the Australian Outback surrounded by heat-based entities." Webb had read the containment documentation for SCP-7033-prime. He knew what would happen if it escaped. The designation prime wasn't just bureaucratic classification. It meant primary, original, the source of something. The files had been heavily redacted, but one phrase had been clear: catastrophic outcome inevitable if exposed to temperatures above freezing in open environment. "How far to Site 91? He asked Chen. She checked her tablet with shaking hands. 60 kilometers. At current speed, 35 minutes. They didn't have 35 minutes. The SUV's engine began making ominous knocking sounds. The temperature gauge had been maxed out for so long that Webb had stopped looking at it, but he could feel the vehicle dying underneath him. The heat was destroying everything. Seals failing, fluids boiling away, metal expanding beyond tolerance. They were driving a machine past its breaking point, and it was only a matter of time before something catastrophic failed. Behind them, Rodriguez's vehicle was in even worse shape. The added weight of the cargo container was putting massive stress on an engine already pushed beyond limits. Webb could see smoke trailing from the SUV's hood, could hear the death rattle of mechanical systems in their final moments. "Rodriguez, status?" he radioed. "Engine temperature critical. I don't think we're gonna make it, Webb. I really don't think." The radio cut off with a burst of static. Webb looked in his mirror and his heart sank. Rodriguez's SUV was slowing, falling behind, smoke pouring from under the hood in thick black clouds. The vehicle limped along for another 50 meters, then began to drift toward the shoulder. "No, no, no," Webb muttered, easing off his own accelerator. "Rodriguez, keep moving." No response. Rodriguez's SUV rolled to a stop at the side of the road. For a moment, nothing happened. Then the doors opened and the crew began to emerge into the killing heat. "What are they doing?" Morrison asked. "They don't have a choice," Chen said quietly. "If they stay in the vehicle, they'll cook. The engine fire will spread. They have to get out." Webb brought his own SUV to a stop. Every instinct screamed at him to keep driving, to abandon the others and save himself and his immediate crew. It was the logical choice, the tactically sound decision. But it was also a death sentence for Rodriguez and the 4 others in his vehicle. "We go back for them," Webb said. "There's no room," Morrison pointed out. "We're already at capacity. If we take on 5 more people, we'll be so overloaded the engine will fail in minutes. Then we make room." Webb opened his door and stepped out into the silent, boiling hell of the desert. The heat was beyond description. It was a physical force, a crushing weight that drove him to his knees on the soft asphalt. His vision went white, then red, then started to tunnel into darkness. He couldn't breathe. Every attempted inhalation brought in air so hot it felt like drowning in fire. And the mirages were everywhere. They surrounded the stopped convoy in a tight circle now, dozens of them, their transparent forms more solid than ever. Webb could see details in their anatomy, organs that looked like they might be hearts, structures that might be nervous systems, all of it made from concentrated heat and light. They moved closer with each passing second, contracting the circle with methodical patience. Rodriguez and his crew were stumbling away from their dead vehicle, moving toward Webb's SUV with the desperate, uncoordinated movements of people in the final stages of heat stroke. The cargo container sat in the back of the abandoned vehicle, frost and steam rising from its surface in equal measure. Webb tried to stand, tried to wave them forward, but his legs wouldn't cooperate. The heat had stolen his strength, had drained him of everything except the most basic survival instinct. He fell forward onto the asphalt, feeling the skin of his palms blister on contact. Hands grabbed him, pulled him up. Morrison, his burned hands wrapped in cloth, had come out to help. Together they stumbled toward Rodriguez's crew, trying to reach them before the Mirages did. But the creatures were faster. They flowed forward like liquid, their transparent forms enveloping Rodriguez and his crew in waves of shimmering air. Webb watched in horror as the crew members began to sink into the Mirages, their bodies becoming translucent, their forms dissolving into the heat haze. They didn't scream, the temperature had stolen their voices, but their faces showed everything. Terror, agony, the awful realization that they were being consumed by something that shouldn't exist. Rodriguez was the last to go. He locked eyes with Webb across the distance, his expression one of resignation. Then he was gone, absorbed into the shimmering mass of the Mirage creature, his body becoming indistinguishable from the heat distortion. Morrison dragged Webb backward toward the SUV. "We have to go. We have to leave them." Webb's mind refused to process what he just witnessed. The Foundation had procedures for everything, protocols for every contingency, but there was no protocol for this. No procedure for watching your colleagues being consumed by living mirages in the middle of the Australian Outback, while the sun burned down from a white sky and the temperature climbed past any reasonable limit. They fell into the SUV, Morrison slamming the door behind them. Chen was in the driver's seat now. Webb didn't remember her switching positions, and she was already accelerating before the doors were fully closed. The cargo container sat abandoned in Rodriguez's vehicle, 30 meters behind them. "We have to go back for it," Morrison shouted. "We can't," Chen said, her voice dead calm. "If we stop again, we die. If we try to retrieve the container, we die. Our only chance is to reach Site 91 and send a recovery team with proper equipment. But SCP-7033-Prime is going to breach containment whether we're here or not. Better that we're not here when it happens." Webb found his voice. "She's right. Drive." Chen drove. The road ahead was a tunnel of shimmering heat and transparent predators. The Mirages lined both sides of the highway in ranks so deep Webb couldn't see past them. They had transformed the desert into their domain, had claimed this stretch of road as their hunting ground, and the convoy had driven right into the center of it. Behind them, the abandoned cargo container was surrounded by Mirages. Webb watched in the mirror as the creatures converged on it, their transparent forms pressing against the frosted metal. Steam erupted where heat met cold, creating a fog bank that obscured the scene. Then the container ruptured. Even from a distance, even through the heat distortion, Webb saw the explosion of freezing air as the cryogenic system failed catastrophically. The temperature differential created a shock wave that rippled outward, visible as a sphere of condensation that expanded and dissipated in seconds. And SCP-7033-Prime emerged. It was hard to see clearly through the distance and distortion, but Webb caught glimpses. Something crystalline, something that reflected light in ways that hurt to look at, something that moved with terrible purpose. The Mirages recoiled from it, their heat-based forms repelled by the intense cold that radiated from the entity. "What is it?" Morrison asked, staring at the mirror. "Something that should have stayed frozen," Chen replied. "Something that Foundation 47 kept at -40 degrees for a very good reason." The entity stood in the middle of the road, a pillar of crystalline cold in a desert of killing heat. Around it, the Mirages circled warily, maintaining distance. Two anomalies, two extremes of temperature, facing each other in the silent wasteland. Then SCP-73 did something that made Webb's blood run cold despite the heat. It began to grow. The crystalline structure expanded rapidly, ice forming from moisture that shouldn't exist in the superheated air. Fractal patterns spread outward from the central mass, each branch spawning new branches, each crystal spawning new crystals. Within seconds, it had doubled in size. Within a minute, it had become a structure 10 meters tall, a frozen architecture that looked both natural and impossibly artificial. And it was getting bigger. "It's feeding on the temperature differential," Chen said with the detached fascination of a scientist, even in the face of disaster. "The extreme heat is providing energy for rapid expansion. It's using the Mirage's own environment against them." The Mirages responded by attacking. They flowed forward en masse, dozens of heat-based entities converging on the frozen structure. Where they made contact, explosions of steam erupted. The battle was silent but intense, heat versus cold, two fundamental forces colliding with apocalyptic energy. "How far to Site 91? Webb asked. 40 kilometers, Chen replied. "But Webb, we can't lead this there. If either the Mirages or SCP-733 reach the site, the casualties will be catastrophic." "Then what do you suggest?" "I don't know. I don't have a solution. I'm just telling you that we can't." The SUV's engine coughed, stuttered, and died. They coasted for another 100 meters on momentum alone, then rolled to a stop in the middle of the highway. Chen tried the ignition. Nothing. Tried again. The starter clicked uselessly. "Engines seized," she said quietly. "We're done." Morrison punched the dashboard in frustration. No, we were almost there. 40 kilometers might as well be 400. Webb said, "We're not walking that distance in this heat. We'd be dead in an hour." They sat in silence, the temperature inside the cab climbing rapidly without the air conditioning. Behind them, the battle between SCP-7033 and the Mirages continued, visible as flashes of steam and distorted light. Ahead, the road stretched empty toward a horizon that looked like it was melting. Webb pulled out his radio. "Site 91, This is Convoy Alpha 7. We are stranded at coordinates. He checked the GPS, which was somehow still functioning. 32.4 south, 146.7 east. Requesting immediate extraction. Multiple casualties. Cargo containment has failed. Repeat, containment has failed. Static answered him. He tried again, adjusting frequencies. More static. The heat's disrupting communications, Chen said. Or the mirages are, or both. We're on our own. Morrison was staring out the back window, his burned hands forgotten. It's winning, he said. SCP-7033 Prime is winning. Webb looked. The crystalline structure had grown massive, a tower of ice that reached 30 meters into the white sky. The mirages were falling back, their heat-based forms unable to withstand the intense cold radiating from the entity. As Webb watched, one mirage ventured too close and simply froze solid, its transparent form becoming a statue of ice that shattered when it hit the ground. If it keeps growing, it'll reach us, Chen said. And unlike the mirages, we can't retreat. We'll freeze solid. Better than being consumed by living heat, Morrison muttered. Webb made a decision. We abandon the vehicle. We walk towards Site 91. Even if we don't make it, we get as far as we can. Maybe we get close enough for communications to work. Maybe we get lucky. Or maybe we die of heat stroke in the first kilometer, Chen said. You have a better idea? She didn't. They prepared as best they could. Webb found emergency supplies in the back of the SUV. Water bottles that were almost too hot to drink, protein bars that had melted into shapeless masses, a first aid kit that seemed laughably inadequate for their situation. They soaked cloth in water and wrapped it around their heads, creating makeshift protection against the sun. Then they opened the doors and stepped out into the killing heat for what they all knew would be the last time. The silence hit Webb first, the absolute crushing silence of a desert at its hottest, when even the wind has died and the air itself seems to be holding its breath. Then came the heat, even worse than before, so intense it felt like being pressed against a furnace. They started walking. Each step was agony. The asphalt was soft under their feet, tacky and yielding. The air was thick, resistant, like moving through invisible syrup. Webb's vision blurred almost immediately, dark spots swimming at the edges, his brain protesting the impossible temperature. Behind them, SCP-733-Prime continued to grow, a tower of crystalline ice that now reached 50 meters into the sky. It had consumed the abandoned vehicles, had frozen the asphalt for 100 meters in every direction. The mirages had retreated to a safe distance, circling the frozen zone but not entering. Ahead, the road stretched on forever. They walked for what felt like hours, but was probably only minutes. Morrison fell first, dropping to his knees on the soft asphalt and not getting back up. Chen and Webb tried to pull him upright, but he was dead weight, his body shutting down from heat stroke. "Leave me," he mumbled. "Keep going." "We don't leave people," Webb said, but even he could hear how weak his voice sounded. Chen was crying, tears evaporating before they could fall. "Marcus, we can't carry him. We can barely walk ourselves." She was right. Webb knew she was right. But he couldn't bring himself to say it. Couldn't bring himself to abandon Morrison, the way they'd been forced to abandon Rodriguez and his crew. The decision was made for them when Chen collapsed. She went down without warning, her legs simply giving out. Webb tried to catch her but missed, and she hit the asphalt hard. Her eyes were open but unfocused, her breathing rapid and shallow. Heat stroke. Advanced stage. Probably fatal without immediate medical intervention. Webb knelt beside her, his own vision going dark. He could feel his body shutting down, could feel his brain cooking in his skull. The heat had won. The desert had won. They'd transported anomalies across continents, had faced horrors that would drive normal people insane, had survived situations that should have killed them a dozen times over. But they couldn't survive the sun. He lay down on the asphalt next to Chen, too exhausted to care that it was burning him. Morrison was a few meters away, motionless. Behind them, SCP-733-Prime had grown into a structure the size of a building, a frozen monument in the desert. The mirages watched from a distance, waiting. Webb closed his eyes. When he opened them again, he was somewhere else. He was standing in a room that was cool and dim, the temperature a comfortable 70 degrees. The walls were the familiar gray of Foundation facilities. A desk, a chair, a computer terminal showing the Site-91 logo. "Agent Webb," a voice said. He turned. A man in a white coat stood beside him, holding a tablet. Dr. something, Webb couldn't quite remember the name. "You made it," the doctor said. "Barely, but you made it. The extraction team found you 15 kilometers from your last known position. You'd walked further than you realized. Heat delirium played tricks with your perception." "Chen? Morrison? Alive. Critical condition, but alive. You all were within minutes of death when we found you." Webb's legs gave out. He sat down hard in the chair, his mind trying to process. They'd made it. Somehow, impossibly, they'd survived. "SCP-733 Prime?" he asked. The doctor's expression darkened. "Still growing. It's created a frozen zone approximately 5 kilometers in diameter. The temperature at the center is minus 100 degrees Celsius. The Mirages, we're calling them SCP-7033A through Z, with more designations being added, have established a perimeter around it. Neither entity appears willing to engage the other anymore." "What are they?" "The Mirages? Best guess is they're thermophilic entities, life forms based on heat rather than chemistry. They camouflage themselves as heat distortion because that's what allows them to move undetected through hot environments. As for SCP-7033-Prime," he paused, "that's classified above your clearance now, but I can tell you that the dead zone is being expanded significantly. No one goes into that area anymore. It's been designated a permanent exclusion zone." Webb nodded slowly. His hands were bandaged. He didn't remember that happening. His throat felt raw, his skin tight and painful. But he was alive. "The others?" he asked. "Rodriguez's crew?" The doctor shook his head. "No remains were recovered. Based on your report, they were consumed by the SCP-7033A entities. We're classifying them as KIA. 5 people dead, an anomaly loose in the desert, a new species of heat-based predator identified and designated, and a convoy that never reached its destination." Webb thought about the silence of the desert, about the mirages that weren't mirages, about the sun that burned down from a white sky. He thought about Rodriguez's face in that final moment, about the crew dissolving into heat haze, about the temperature climbing past any reasonable limit into ranges where human life couldn't exist. "The report," the doctor said, handing him the tablet. "We need your full account for the record." Webb took the device and stared at the blank screen. How do you put something like that into words? How do you explain heat that was alive, mirages that hunted, a sun that never set? He started typing. "Convoy log, SCP-7033 transport operation. Day 1. External temperature at departure, 92 degrees Fahrenheit and rising." The words came slowly at first, then faster, as he documented everything. The mirages, the heat, the silence, the way the desert had transformed from landscape into predator. The doctor left him alone to write, and Webb wrote until his hands cramped and his eyes burned. Outside the window, the sun was setting over Site-91, painting the sky in reds and oranges. But Webb knew that somewhere to the north, in a dead zone that would never be crossed again, the sun never set. It just burned and burned and burned, while mirages that weren't mirages watched and waited. And in the center of it all, a tower of impossible ice grew ever larger, feeding on the temperature differential, creating its own frozen kingdom in the heart of the hottest desert on Earth. Webb finished his report and submitted it to the Foundation database. Then he sat back in the chair and closed his eyes, trying not to think about the heat, about the silence, about the mirages waiting in the shimmer. But he knew he'd never forget. The desert remembered everything. And now so did he.